Good evening and welcome. Thank you for coming through these warm and welcoming doors. Thank you for making time. Thank you for waiting and for fighting traffic. Thank you for parking and thank you for your patience as we waited for all of you to arrive. I would like to start this evening by saying a few words about 3 young Israeli students who were kidnapped on their way home over a week ago. There are times when everyone's hearts are beating as one. There's no political divisions, no left, no right, no center, no periphery. We're all parents, brothers, sisters. This is the time to come together in solidarity as we embrace Gilad Sha'ar, Naftali Frankel, and Eyal Yifrach. We will keep them in our minds and hearts until they come home. To those of you who are here for the first time, welcome to this wonderful Reconstructionist community of Darchei Noam, a group of people whose strength lies in its ideological stance, in commitment to learning, in social action, and in Jewish celebration. And our dear, loyal members, thank you. The Elka Klein Memorial Lecture Series was established in 2008 as a living memorial of Elka Klein, Zichrona Livracha, daughter of our members Martin and Suzanne Sil Klein. The series mirrors Professor Klein's broad interest, including Jewish history, evolving halachic practice, and Jewish ethics. We thank Marty and Suzanne for their generous endowment, which will allow this series to thrive into the future. Elka Klein was a young academic, specializing in medieval Jewish history. She grew up in Toronto. Also, her post-secondary education and career were in the United States. This community, Darchei Noam, was her first shul. She was active here as a young teenager, and her family thought it appropriate that she will be remembered here. Elka Klein was author of 2 books and numerous articles. At the time of her death, she was an assistant professor of Judaic studies at the University of Cincinnati. Much of her work centered on the way in which Jews fit into their larger society while retaining their Jewish identity and culture. As an American in Canada and a Canadian in the United States, she was intensely interested in personal and communal identity and in comparisons between the 2 worlds in which she lived. Unfortunately, I never was able to meet Elka personally. Therefore, Suzanne, her mother, graciously provided me with a marvelous essay by Reuven Lerner, who met Elka at Harvard, where they participated in the egalitarian minyan together. What I'm about to read is an excerpt from a larger essay. Quote, "When I graduated from college, I discovered the community of graduate students, Lerner writes, that had grown up around the minyan. This was immediately obvious on Sukkot when Elka hosted all of us at her sukkah. It wasn't the biggest sukkah, and there were places where she made sure that we wouldn't sit while eating because it wasn't kosher in that part. But it was typical of Elka to build a sukkah and then invite or demand that we would all come and enjoy it. I'm a graduate student myself now, and I know how little time and money grad students have. And yet that did not stop her from being aggressively hospitable, constantly having people over for Shabbat and holiday meals. This hospitality didn't change over the years. When I was in Toronto for Louis and Aurora's wedding, these are the children of our members who are members. She was happy to show us around town. And when I was in New York for Shabbat, she and Yossi were kind enough to invite me to their black tie Friday night dinner, an experience which I continue to remember fondly to this day. Tonight is a privilege. Even after Elka has left us, her hospitality is still evident. End of quote. Historians and the rest of us look at the research data differently. I want to emphasize the fact that Elka would have seen the finding of the Pew research fascinating and necessary. Pew Research report as a continuation and development of our Jewish civilization, and the insight that numbers and what they represent to us is extraordinarily important. The findings represent our civilization, and we deeply care for its future and its present. One might ask what the dead want from the living. They want that those who are left here thrive, learn, and celebrate life in their memory. We cannot thank enough Suzanne, Klein, and Marty Klein, whose deep kindness and passion for Jewish life, and this community, and our guests tonight, an opportunity to learn and to thrive. We're here to honor this extraordinary woman's memory through learning. Thank you, thank you. Thank you for your vision and for your generosity. I thank you on behalf of our community, and we're excited to learn.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. The program indicates that Janice Stein is going to be introducing, but after having battled traffic on Bathurst for hours, we're going to give her a break and let her settle in before we call on her. It's my honor to have been part of this event in the organizing committee of adult education and the marketing communications committee. Very briefly, I just want to say a couple things about the evening. As you know, the Pew Research Center in the U.S. Released a landmark study on the American Jewish community last fall, generated tremendous interest not only in the United States but here in Canada, and I think we felt that this would be a fitting topic for this year's Elka Klein Memorial Lecture. So we were very fortunate to have one of the chief researchers, Greg Smith from Washington, come to present, and a wonderful panel of people from the Canadian community to comment. I'm not going to introduce, we'll let Janice introduce the panel after the presentation. We're going to start with Greg, and what I've asked Greg to do is to give us about a 30-minute presentation of the highlights, some of the best parts and most interesting parts of this research, the parts that will be of most interest to us here in Canada. It is an American survey, it's about Americans, and we all know Canadians are different. I've known Greg for a few years. He is one of the leading public opinion researchers in the US, certainly on topics of religion. He works at a part of the very respected Pew Research Center that focuses on study of many religions of different kinds. The bio is in the program, so I'm not going to get into more details, but please join me in welcoming Greg to our congregation.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and be here with all of you tonight. Thank you very much to the Klein family for hosting me and hosting this event. It's a real privilege and an honor for me to be here. I've been looking forward to it. And what I'd like to do tonight, as you know, is share some of the key findings from our 2013 survey of Jews in the United States. And I'll focus on the survey's findings with respect to the background characteristics and the demographics of Jews in the United States. I'll talk a little bit about the survey's findings with respect to Jewish identity and community involvement, Jewish observance and religious beliefs and practices, as well as connection with and attitudes toward Israel. And what we'll see, I think, is that in many ways the Jewish community in the United States is thriving. Most Jews in the United States tell us that they're very proud to be Jewish. Most Jews in the United States tell us that they feel a very strong connection to the Jewish people. But at the same time, the survey also shows that the Jewish community in the United States is changing in some important ways. A growing number of Jews, a growing share of Jews in the United States are what we call in the report, and what I'll refer to tonight, a growing share of Jews in the United States are Jews of no religion. And Jews of no religion, the data show, are much less connected to and much less involved with the Jewish community than are Jews by religion. And we'll focus on that moving forward and we can think about what some of the implications of those findings are. And I'll say more about them as we move ahead. But let me start with a little bit of background about how this project came about and how exactly we went about doing it. You know, we have a track record at the Pew Research Center of doing lots of surveys of religion in the United States. We've done surveys of the general population. We've done surveys of large religious groups in the United States, like Catholics and evangelical Protestants. We've also done a series of surveys of smaller religious and ethnic groups in the United States. We've done 2 surveys of Muslims living in the United States. We did a survey of Mormons in the U.S. in 2011 in the run-up to Mitt Romney's candidacy for president. We've done surveys of Hispanics and religion in the United States. We've even done a survey of Asian Americans and the way they approach religion in the United States. So we have that kind of track record of survey research. And then, I forget the exact date, but it's sometime in 2011 or 2012, we learned that there would be no update of the national Jewish population studies that had been conducted in 1970, and again in 1990, and again in 2000 and 2001. The NJPS, the National Jewish Population Study, was not going to be updated around the 2010, 2011, 2012 time frame. So conducting this study, for us, was consistent with our broader research agenda, but it also, and very importantly, helped fill this important gap in that it is the largest and most comprehensive national study of U.S. Jews since that 2000-2001 NJPS. Of course, I have to point out right up front that our survey is very different from the NJPS series of studies. Perhaps the most notable difference is that those studies were funded by and supported by, conducted by, the organized Jewish communities in the United States. And that is not the case with our study. Partly as a result of that, I think it's safe to say, the studies had very different aims. You know, the NJPS series of studies were very much focused on exploring the needs of the Jewish community in the United States and trying to assess the degree to which those needs were or were not being met. Our survey's a little bit different. Like all of our surveys, our main goal here was to try and inform a very broad audience, including Jews, but also the broader U.S. general population, about the experiences and the characteristics and the attitudes and the beliefs and practices of Jews in the United States. So it's really a pretty different kind of survey. With that said, we've been very gratified to see just how interested the Jewish community, certainly in the United States, seems to have been in the survey's findings, and I hope that you all will find it of interest as well. This, in a nutshell, is what we did. You know, conducting studies of small groups within a population is always a challenge. We did this survey by randomly dialing both cell phones and landlines in the United States from all around the country. In total, we talked with upwards of 70,000 people. And of those, about 5,100 of them were eligible for our longer main survey of Jews, in that they identified themselves as Jewish or said that they were raised Jewish or had a Jewish parent. It's also worth noting, I think, that as part of our study, we oversampled both Orthodox Jews and Jews who were from the former Soviet Union or whose parents were from the former Soviet Union. We wanted to try hard to represent those communities as well as the broader Jewish community in the United States. One of the toughest questions that we faced in thinking about how to do this study was how to identify Jewish respondents. We realized that the question of who is a Jew is a fraught question. We know that being Jewish isn't necessarily or even primarily a matter of religion. So identifying people who were eligible to participate in the study was tough. And ultimately what we decided to do was use a very, very broad approach. And we used these 3 screening questions. We first asked people about their religion. And anyone who answered that first question by describing themselves as Jewish was eligible to take our full survey. For those who didn't identify themselves as Jewish in response to the first question, we asked a second question. Do you think of yourself as Jewish or partially Jewish aside from religion? Anybody answering yes to that question was eligible to take the full survey. If you did not identify as Jewish either by religion or aside from religion, the third screening question we asked was, were you raised Jewish or did you have a Jewish parent? And here again, anybody answering that question affirmatively was eligible to participate in the full main survey. And that group of people who took the full main survey is the group that numbered just north of 5,100 people. But, and this is a very important point, even though we administered the survey to that very broad group of people, we focused in our analysis on 2 groups that we ultimately categorized as Jewish. Jews by religion, as I'll use that term moving forward, are those people who answer the first question right here by describing themselves as Jewish. These are simply folks who, when asked about their religion, as we ask in many of our surveys, describe themselves as Jewish. The second group that we categorized as Jewish in our analyses are the group that we call Jews of no religion. These are people who, in response to that first question, describe themselves as atheist or as agnostic or as just nothing in particular. But then, in response to the second question, they tell us they do think of themselves as Jewish or partially Jewish aside from religion, and they confirm, furthermore, that they were raised Jewish or that they had at least one Jewish parent. That's the group that we refer to as Jews of no religion. As I mentioned, I'll use these terms throughout. I hope that they're sensible and appropriate. I know that not everyone has endorsed our use of these terms. We didn't invent these terms. They have been used by other researchers before, although I'm not quite sure that I've ever seen anything with exactly these definitional criteria. But I hope these terms are useful and appropriate. And but I should point out right from the get-go one important point, and that's really in response to a question that's come up. Where is it in our survey, where in our survey results can we find secular Jews? Where can we find people who may not believe in God, may not be particularly religious, but who nevertheless are deeply committed to being Jewish, are deeply involved in the Jewish community? Where can we find those folks? Because they don't seem to be very well represented in that group that we call Jews of no religion. We'll see moving forward that Jews of no religion, by and large, are not particularly engaged in the Jewish community in the United States. So where is the secular Jewish tradition in the United States? And I'd say, paradoxically perhaps, I think they're actually found among the group that we call Jews by religion. We will see as we move ahead that there are many Jews by religion, as I use that term, who in fact don't believe in God, who in fact tell us that religion isn't particularly important to them in their lives. It doesn't mean being Jewish is unimportant. It doesn't mean that they're not involved in the Jewish community, but they're not particularly religious. I think that's where they are in these data, and we'll see that moving forward. So these terms, Jews by religion and Jews of no religion, are technical terms in that sense. They are not meant to imply anything about any given individual's personal level of observance or religious commitment. Instead, they're technical terms used to describe how people answer these screening questions. Now, I do think that understanding the dynamics between of the Jewish by religion population and Jews of no religion is one of the first and most important things to understand about the background and characteristics of Jews in the United States today. The first thing I'd point out is that Jews of no religion are a large and growing share of the Jewish community in the United States. More than 1 in 5 Jews in the United States today is a Jew of no religion. And if we look at how that breaks down, thank you very much. If we look at how that breaks down by generational cohort, that's how we can see that their numbers are rising. Among the oldest generational cohort in the United States, among members of the greatest generation, very few are Jews of no religion. More than 9 in 10 are Jews by religion. But among millennial Jews, those born after 1980 or so, fully 1 in 3 are Jews of no religion. The data also show that Jews of no religion are younger than Jews by religion. Jews by religion, the median age of Jews by religion is 52 in the United States. Among Jews of no religion, it's much younger, only 43. The data also show that Jews of no religion have fewer children than Jews by religion, 1.5 on average compared with 2.1. And Jews of no religion are far, far less likely to be raising their children Jewish as compared with Jews by religion. Among Jews by religion who are today parenting minor children in their household, the vast majority, upwards of 9 in 10, say that they are raising those children Jewish, or at least partially Jewish. And that includes 7 in 10 who say they're raising their children as Jews by religion. But look at Jews of no religion. Most Jews of no religion who are currently parenting minor children say they are not raising those children Jewish, either by religion or otherwise. Now this reflects in part the fact that married Jews of no religion are much, much more likely to be intermarried as compared with Jews by religion. You can see here that about 2/3 of Jews by religion, married Jews by religion, are married to a Jewish spouse. But among Jews of no religion, 8 in 10 are married to a non-Jewish spouse. And the data also show, I don't have a slide for this, but the data also show that intermarried couples are far less likely to be raising their children Jewish as compared with in-married couples. Now, more broadly, the survey finds that intermarriage is very common in the Jewish community in the United States. I'm sure this doesn't come as any surprise. And that intermarriage is on the rise. Overall, 44% of Jews in the United States are married to a non-Jewish spouse. Look at how that changes over time. This isn't really change over time, but look at how this is different across people depending on when they got married. Among Jews who got married before 1970, just 17% are married to a non-Jewish spouse. But among Jews who got married in 2000 or later, almost 6 in 10 are married to a non-Jewish spouse. So intermarriage is very common, and the data suggests that it seems to be rising. It shouldn't come as any surprise, given those findings, that if intermarriage is on the rise, it only makes sense that that means that a growing percentage of Jews in the United States are themselves the children of intermarried backgrounds. And that's what we can see in this slide. Among the oldest generational cohort, among people in the silent generation, the vast majority, 92%, say that both of their parents were Jewish. But look at millennial Jews. They're pretty much evenly divided between those who have two Jewish parents and those who come from an intermarried background. Now, I realize that the topic of intermarriage is one of great concern for the Jewish community, certainly in the United States. And many people have raised questions about the implications of intermarriage and growing rates of intermarriage for the Jewish community. And our own survey shows some good reason for that. Intermarried couples are much less likely to be raising their children Jewish. They tend to be people who are in mixed marriages tend to be less involved in the Jewish community. But with that said, there is one really interesting finding from our survey that might cut in the other direction, if you will, and that is this. A growing number of people in the United States who come from an intermarried background, whose parents were intermarried, a growing share of people in the United States whose parents were intermarried are Jewish. If we look, this slide is a little, let me walk through it. It's a little complicated. It's different than all the other slides in that this is the only slide in the entire presentation that isn't limited just to Jews. The people in this slide are basically all American adults who have one Jewish parent. The vast majority of them are not Jewish. 3/4 of American adults over the age of 65 who have one Jewish parent are not Jewish. Most of them are Christian. A smaller number of them might not be Christian, but they nevertheless no longer identify themselves as Jewish in any way, either by religion or aside from religion. But look what happens as you move across the chart from the older generational cohort to the younger generational cohort. Among adults in their 30s and 40s who have one Jewish parent, most are not Jewish. 60% are not Jewish. But that 60% is smaller than the 75% that we see among people age 65 and older. And most importantly, look at this group. Among millennials in the United States, among basically adults who are in their 20s in the United States, who have one Jewish parent, most of them are Jewish. 60% of adults, of American adults, of US adults in their 20s who have one Jewish parent are Jewish. That's almost the exact opposite of what we see among the oldest generation in our data. So on the one hand, intermarriage may raise concerns. On the other hand, these data suggest that intermarriage, at least in this way, might actually be enlarging the Jewish community in important ways. What else can the survey tell us about the background characteristics and demographics of Jews in the United States? I think one of the most interesting findings has to do with denominational identity. Those numbers are a little dark, but basically what the data show is that Reform Judaism remains the largest denominational stream. Upwards of 1/3 of Jews in the United States identify with Reform Judaism. About 1 in 5 identify with Conservative Judaism. 10% identify as Orthodox Jews. 1% identify with the Reconstructionist movement. And notice that large group, 3 in 10, who say they have no denominational identity. That group appears to be growing as well. It's larger among the youngest generation than it is among older generations. The data also show that the Orthodox are younger than people from other denominational backgrounds, and they also tend to have much larger families than other Jews in the United States, suggesting that their numbers are likely to grow. I don't know if these numbers, or I don't know if these patterns will come as much as of a surprise, but I think the actual numbers are really striking. Orthodox Jews have more than twice as many children on average as compared with Jews from other denominational backgrounds. One key purpose of the survey, one of the main reasons we did it, is we wanted to be able to explore questions of Jewish identity. What does being Jewish mean to Jews in the United States? What's viewed as an essential part of being Jewish, and what's more peripheral? And here I think there's really several interesting findings to share. The first thing, and I mentioned this already, but I think the first thing to note is that overwhelming numbers of Jews in the United States tell us they are proud to be Jewish and they have a strong sense of belonging to the Jewish people. Jews also tell us, in large numbers, that being Jewish is more a matter of ancestry and culture than it is a matter of religion. Now, I'm sure that this finding probably won't come as much of a surprise to many people in this room, but I think this is a good example of our efforts in this survey to try to inform and educate the broader public as much as it is to be helpful to the Jewish community. I don't know that this is something that the American general public necessarily would have known or appreciated about the Jewish community in the United States. And it's one thing to say it as a matter of fact, that being Jewish is as much a matter of ethnicity or ancestry or culture as it is of religion, but it's another thing to be able to put hard numbers to it and to say, look, 6 in 10 Jews in the United States say that being Jewish is mainly a matter of ancestry or culture. Just 15% say it's mainly a matter of religion. I personally was really struck by the figures here for Jews by religion. Even among, and this gets back to what I was saying earlier about how these terms don't necessarily imply anything about people's priority or own personal level of observance. Even among Jews by religion, most say that being Jewish is mainly a matter of ancestry or culture, not so much a matter of religion. When we ask people whether or not each of a series of items is essential to what it means to be Jewish, or important but not essential or not important, the most commonly named responses are remembering the Holocaust and leading an ethical and moral life. Most Jews, smaller numbers, but most Jews also cite working for justice and equality as essential to what being Jewish means to them, and about half name being intellectually curious as essential to their own Jewish identity. Smaller numbers cite things like being part of a Jewish community, observing Jewish law, or eating traditional Jewish foods as essential to their Jewish identity. This is another example, I think. I'll just point it out. Sometimes when I've spoken with people from the Jewish community, they wonder why we ask some of the things that we ask. And, you know, like I say, a lot of it gets back to trying to inform the broader public. I am not Jewish myself. I'm Catholic myself, and, you know, this survey was informed by lots of cooperation and collaboration with scholars in the Jewish community. And they were crucial to the success of the project, and they taught me a lot. And sometimes we got in arguments because they would say to me, you know, you shouldn't even really ask about how important observing Jewish law is, because that's not going to rank very highly on the list. There are other things that are more important to Jews. And I kept saying, I understand that. I can appreciate that. This may well result in low numbers naming this as key to their Jewish identity. But look, I am not Jewish, but I'm a representative of the audience we're trying to reach. I'm a fairly well-educated person. I would be a member of our target audience if I didn't work for the Pew Research Center. I took a college class on world religions. What do they teach you in college classes on world religions about Judaism? They teach you about monotheism and the law. If we want people to understand what it means to be Jewish in the United States today, and we want them to know what it means to members of the community and not what they read in their college world religions textbook. These are exactly the kinds of questions that we have to ask. So I'd like to think that the survey hopefully helped in that regard. One of the really interesting things about this question, I think, is what we see if we look at the results broken out by age cohorts. You know, we found a lot of things we found a lot of areas in which younger Jews are very distinctive compared with older Jews. Younger Jews, we've already pointed out, are more likely than older Jews to be Jews of no religion. Younger Jews are more likely to say they have no denominational attachment. Younger Jews are less likely than older Jews to feel a strong connection to Israel. And you can actually see that on this chart right here. About half of Jews over the age of 50 say that caring about Israel is essential to what being Jewish means to them, compared with just a third of Jews in their 20s. But beyond that, what we see here on this question of what's essential to their Jewish identity is really a picture of similarities more so than of differences. Younger Jews name the same priorities as older Jews. Younger Jews, just like older Jews, say that it's remembering the Holocaust and leading an ethical and moral life, working for justice and equality in society that's essential to their Jewish identity. So this is one area of the survey where we find strong commonality between younger Jews and older Jews. That question was about what's essential to people's Jewish identity. This question was designed more to get at boundaries. Where do people draw the lines? What is ultimately compatible with being Jewish and what really is not? And what we found here is that the vast majority of Jews tell us that someone can be Jewish even if they work on the Sabbath. Someone can be Jewish even if they're strongly critical of Israel. Someone can be Jewish, smaller numbers, but still 2/3 say that someone can be Jewish even if they don't believe in God. Believing in Jesus, however, is beyond the pale for most Jews. 6 in 10 Jews in the United States say no. If someone believes that Jesus is the Messiah, you can't really be Jewish and believe Jesus was the Messiah. Now this is another question that raised a lot of eyebrows. I'm not surprised that it evokes laughter. But this is another example, I think, of where we can really learn something and where we can see that for many Jews, a minority in this case, but that being Jewish really isn't a matter of religious belief. I remember shortly after we released the report, someone posted a comment on our website, a commenter, at the end of it must have been a blog entry that was on our website about the survey. And this comment was strongly critical of us. It said, what are these people from Pew doing? You know, asking Jews about whether or not they can believe in Jesus, and then finding that a third of Jews, 3 in 10, say that someone can be Jewish even if they believe Jesus was the Messiah. Basically, Pew is an outrageous organization that doesn't know what they're doing. That was the implication of the comment. And I read it with concern and thought to myself, I wonder how we should respond to this. But I didn't have to, because the next comment, right underneath that comment, was from somebody else responding to that comment. And it said, that this commenter said, look, I am an Orthodox Jew. I don't care if you believe in Jesus. I don't care if you become Catholic. I don't care if you become the Pope in Rome. That's a direct quote from this comment. If you have a Jewish mother, you are Jewish. Period. And I thought that was really enlightening. And it really, it drives home the difficulty of this question. Who is a Jew? Imagine, from a survey researcher, trying to figure out what questions can we ask to identify, how do we define our terms. It's really quite difficult. But I think this question is really illustrative of the way in which that's true. The survey also included a variety of questions about Jewish connectedness with the community, involvement in the organized Jewish community. We find about 1 in 3 Jews saying that they are themselves members of a synagogue, and about 18% say that they are members of another Jewish organization. And more than half of Jews in the United States report having donated to a Jewish organization or cause in the previous year. And you can see here on this slide one of the main examples of the lower levels of engagement and involvement among Jews of no religion. Very few Jews of no religion are members of synagogues or any other Jewish organization, and they donate to Jewish organizations at much lower rates as compared with Jews by religion. In terms of Jewish observance and religious beliefs and practices, the survey finds about 7 in 10 Jews saying that they participated in a Seder last year, and about half say that they fasted for all or part of Yom Kippur in the previous year. Fewer say that they regularly light Sabbath candles or keep kosher in their home. And I don't have it here, but only about 13% indicated that they avoid handling money on the Sabbath. This is another example of where you can see that Jews of no religion across the board exhibit much lower levels of observance as compared with Jews of no religion. And Jews by religion. And at the other end of the spectrum, you can see that Orthodox Jews really are unusual at the other end compared to most Jews in the United States. Virtually all Orthodox Jews say that they participated in a Seder last year and that they fasted on the last Yom Kippur. And big majorities also say that they regularly light Sabbath candles and that they keep kosher in their homes. I should also just point out that on other measures of religious belief and practices, things that we can ask both Jews as well as other religious groups in the United States, things like attendance at religious services, things like belief in God, Jews exhibit much lower levels of religious commitment on those kinds of measures as compared with other groups in American society. Just 26% of Jews, for instance, say that religion is a very important part of their lives. And that compares with 56% among the US population as a whole. Another example, 2/3 of Jews say they believe in God. That's a big number, most. But among the U.S. general population, upwards of 90% say that they believe in God. So you see that kind of thing on a number of measures of religious belief and practice. Let me wrap up with just a couple of the survey's interesting findings about connections with and attitudes toward Israel. Most Jews in the United States, about 7 in 10, say that they feel at least somewhat emotionally attached to the state of Israel. And that number's been pretty steady since the NJPS in 2000-2001. 4 in 10 Jews in the United States say that they themselves have visited Israel, and that includes some who even have lived in Israel. The data also show that 4 in 10 Jews in the United States believe that Israel was given by God to the Jewish people. At the same time, however, the survey also finds that Jews in the United States express certain reservations about Israeli policies in some respects. Just 17% of American Jews say that they think the continued building of settlements in the West Bank helps Israel's security. Much larger numbers, 44% say that hurts Israel's security, and 3 in 10 say that it makes no difference. I was really struck by these findings. Fewer than half of Jews in the United States say they believe that the Israeli government is making a sincere effort toward peace with the Palestinians. Just 38% of Jews in the United States express that point of view. Now, to be sure, Jews in the United States, there are far more Jews in the United States who think Israel is making a sincere effort than think the Palestinian leadership is making a sincere effort. Still, I think it's interesting that less than half of Jews in the U.S. say they think the Israeli government is sincere in this regard. I think I'm going to stop there. I hope that this presentation has been informative. I hope that it's effectively conveyed what we found most striking, which, as I said, is that the Jewish community in the United States is thriving in many ways, but it's also undergoing significant and important changes. I should also point out, I think I alluded to this before, but I don't actually know how much or how little these findings in the United States reflect what's happening in Canada. There may be some similarities, there may be some differences. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you really about your impressions of that. I'm not aware of any recent data on Canada, on the Jewish community in Canada that would let us make analytical comparisons, but I'm really looking forward to getting your thoughts and impressions and ideas about how this may or may not track with what's happening in Canada. So I'll thank you and I'll look forward to our discussion.
Of the Canadian Jewish community. We have very few. And Klein is an outstanding contributor. So he will engage, I hope, directly with the differences between Canada and the United States. And next to Klein is Rabbi Aaron Levy. I know Rabbi Levy because I live downtown. That's why it took me an hour and a half to get here this evening. And Rabbi Levy is responsible, I think, more than anyone else for the revival of Jewish life in downtown core. He's done really a remarkable job, and I think he speaks to some of the younger demographic that you identified there. So let me start off with a question to all three of you. Put away the notes. Leave on. And let me ask you, what surprised you most in what you're looking at? What was counterintuitive? What did you not expect? Let me start with you, Bernie.
Okay, now, I have this turned on. Can people hear me?
No.
Well, it's lucky that I have a very loud voice. I think, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
No. Short answers. I was both surprised and not surprised at the number of folks who both supported Israel on the one hand, the small number that actually cared for Israel in relation to two very key issues that have had my attention for almost 30 years, and that is the issue of social justice, the issue of equality, and the issue of ethics. And what that told me was, if we're looking at it in relation to Canadian Jewry, there has been a wholesale change in advocacy here, for example, in Canadian Jewry. When there was a Canadian Jewish Congress, and some of you will be surprised to hear it no longer exists. Social justice, ethics, equality, anti-discrimination were the issues that we followed and embraced. Today, it's completely different. Today, we have our advocacy agent known as CJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, whose primary focus, and I get this, and we all understand this, is Israel. But as their primary focus is Israel, they have left on the back of the bus, sad to say, issues of social justice, equality, refugee determination, refugee legislation, all of those issues that we cared so deeply about. So the actual numbers in this particular survey shows that we were, if we're trending, and that's another question that we have to talk about, if we're trending in the way of the Americans, and I believe that we are, we have made a serious error in judgment in terms of the advocacy direction that we're taking.
So that's a really provocative statement. I want to come back to that. Frank, what surprised you most, and how do you think the Canadian Jewish community differs from the picture that Greg?
Thanks very much. A lot of what I'm thinking, Bernie, is already encapsulated. My brother Bernie here from CJC. One of the things that surprised me was the 10% of American Jews, or the Jews of the United States, as I prefer to call them, that are identified as Orthodox. I thought it would be higher. because certainly we know it's growing. I was also surprised that it's only 4.1%, 4.1 children rather per family. I was absolutely flabbergasted that 34% of Jews believe that Jesus was the Messiah.
That's not incompatible with being.
Oh, not incompatible with being Jewish. Yes. Okay. Well, all right. Fair enough. I was somewhat surprised that slightly over 70% of Jews voted Democrat. I thought it would have been slightly less than that. But overall, the information which I don't think came up in one of in one of your slides, was it? On voting? No. Yeah. Okay. So by and large, I wasn't really surprised by what I saw in the Pew report. In terms of the differences, I think the differences are vast. With respect to two of the major trends, intermarriage and the rise of orthodoxy, I mean, both of those things are taking place in Canada. Clearly, the intermarriage rates are lower than they are in the United States. Clearly, the percentage of Jews who are Orthodox and perhaps moving into Orthodox, moving away from non-religion or other Jewish denominations is greater. Our major problem in Canada is that the Conservative government has axed any meaningful census, so that we really don't know anything about, well, I wouldn't say anything, but we don't have hard data about who we are. We don't know how many Jews live in this country. Right? So this Pew report is something that I would like to see for Canada. I don't know where it's going to come from, right? But certainly as a student of this history and a writer of this history, this is tremendously important.
Frank, let me ask you one follow-up question and ask Greg to comment before I go to you, Aaron. When you extrapolate the demographic data, there are predictions that in the United States, the Orthodox Jewish community will be dominant in 50 years. Do you think that's correct, Greg? And Frank, do you think that's true in Canada? And it's all around the birth rate. If you are having 4.1 children, you are replacing yourself twice. If you are having 1.5 or 1.6, you are not replacing yourself. And so they take those numbers, project them forward, and we get a very different Jewish community, certainly in the United States, than we currently have. So do you consider that forecast accurate 50 years out? And Frank, what do you think in Canada?
It's very hard to say. If all we were looking at was demographic characteristics, there would be no question.
Right.
However, that's not all we have to look at. One of the things that's really interesting about the United States, and I don't know to what extent this is also true in Canada, I'd be interested to know, is that people change their religions. Among all adults in the United States today, these are going to be underestimates because they come from old data from about 7 years ago. Among all adults in the United States today, 44% have a religion that's different than the religion in which they were raised. 44%. If you add to that all of the people who have switched religions at least once but ended up back in the religion of their childhood, it's north of 50%. So religious switching is extremely common. And the data show that that is also true for Jews. Lots of Jews in the United States switch in and out of Judaism altogether, but many others switch across denominational movements. If you look at everyone who is raised Orthodox and who is over the age of about 65 today, most of them aren't Orthodox. It's a tiny minority of them who are Orthodox. I think the number is somewhere in the neighborhood of 20%. So the prediction might well hold true if all we have to look at is demographic factors, but that assumes that people will retain the religious identity of their childhood. Now, the data do show that among young adults today who were raised Orthodox, most of them are still Orthodox. I think it's 80% or something like that of adults in their 20s who were raised Orthodox are still Orthodox. But among a previous generation of people who were raised Orthodox, most are not Orthodox. Now, whether or not those young people are going to switch or not.
Okay, let's see what Rabbi Aaron thinks about that. What do you think?
Well, actually, can I answer your general question first? So actually, the thing that I found most surprising about the overall results of the Pew survey were that they actually hewed very closely to really what I see in downtown Toronto, both anecdotally and, at least it's kind of dated, but looking at some of the actual hard data that we have from prior studies of Canadian Jewry from 1991 most recently, which is quite old at this point, but here in the GTA in 2001 and 2005. Within those latter two studies, there's a lot of segmenting out of different geographies of Jews, and so I'm very interested in looking at the downtown Jewish population, and I found almost to a T congruence between a lot of the numbers in terms of like rates of interfaith marriage, Jews by religion, Jews of no religion, closeness or distance from Israel, things like that, between what you're reporting from the US and what's going on downtown. So I thought that was very interesting. And I think to the extent that, as Bernie and Frank were saying, that while we don't know exactly what will happen in the future in Canada, of course, there is a sense that America is, as the common adage, right, a generation ahead of Jews in Canada because of earlier immigration patterns, right? That the U.S. is the direction in which Canada is headed in terms of the Jewish community. I'd say downtown is already there, and therefore it's interesting to look at what's going on already locally downtown to see like what's working, what's not working in terms of helping Jews find positive connections Jewishly.
So what does work and what doesn't work in downtown Jewish Toronto that might surprise people who live an hour and a half from the downtown? What do you find works?
I think a number of things work, at least in my experience with Macomb, which is a grassroots downtown Jewish community that I founded 5 years ago to try to meet the needs of downtown Jews who really run across a very broad spectrum of Jewish ideology and affiliation and stuff. But I'd say what I'm finding is working are challenging people, particularly in the areas of spirituality, because I do think that Judaism as a religion is an important component of what it means to be Jewish. And so obviously I'm quite biased in this, but I think also that the data does bear this out. So I think challenging people spiritually to actually be active participants in their own religious lives, whether that means in the context of prayer services, in which everyone is an active participant and no one can sort of sit back and just listen to a cantor, or whether it's through Jewish meditation circles, monthly women's, Rosh Chodesh, new moon groups that are spiritually oriented, things like that really challenge people to take ownership of their Jewish spiritual lives. And also, I'd say, in terms of intellectual engagement, that we shouldn't be presenting Judaism as a salve or a pablum that is just sort of easy and it'll solve your problems or anything like that, but really making people think hard and work hard to understand Jewish texts, whether in an original language like Hebrew or Aramaic or in translation. It almost doesn't matter in terms of people actually being intellectually challenged and stimulated, let's say. That those are the kinds of things that actually grab people's attention, even if they might have been disaffiliated from organized Jewish community for a dozen years.
So I was struck, and I'd be interested in Frank's comment, and I'm sure both rabbis here were struck by the fact that the percentage of Jews whose primary identification is religion was so low in that survey. Do you think that's accurate for Canada, Frank, or do you think it's different?
Well, again, I come back to what I said before, Janice, and that is that we don't know, because we don't have the data. I would tend to think probably not. I take great issue with the common held adage that the Canadian Jewish community is a generation behind the American Jewish community. Really from the outset, from the time of the Great Migration, 120 years, it started 125 years ago. First the United States in the 1870s and 80s, and then Canada at the turn of the century. We've really evolved in very different ways, and we're very different communities. The essential difference between us and them is that they believe, or they accept the myth of American or United Statesian exceptionalism. We don't have that myth. That frames very much, who American Jews are. It helps them meld into the melting pot. It helps them see themselves as part of this great national whatever you want to call it, crusade, perhaps.
Shining city on the hill.
Right. In a non-religious way. That's not who. I think my computer just went off. That's not who Canadian Jews are. And I think that what this Pew research shows is, in fact, how different Canadian Jews are than American Jews are.
See, I disagree with my esteemed colleague here. I actually do think that generational issues play a very key role. And let me tell you. Okay, Mr. Techman. I'll just try and speak as loud as I can. Please use the mic.
But we get feedback as we go to the mic.
Turn off your lapel mic and then use yours.
Okay, is that better? Yeah. So I was saying that I believe that generational issues do play an important role. Let me tell you why I think this. For the most part, here in Canada, we are 1, 2, and at the very most 3 generations past to show up. So what do I mean by that? I am a first-generation Canadian. Both of my parents were born in Europe. My father was a survivor. My mother came just prior to the war. The vast majority of my baby boomer friends are first-generation Canadians. The vast majority. Others, like my wife, she's a second-generation Canadian, and very few that I know are actually third-generation Canadians. As a result, what I have found is that the closer you are to the show up, the more there is this existential angst that we struggle with in regards to who we are as Jews. Hence, this connectedness to the state of Israel seems much stronger here in Canada than it does in the United States because of the distance that we have traveled, or the distance that we haven't traveled. Hence, we see in the United States 70% of the folks, of Jewish folks, voting Democrat or somewhere close to that. That was true, interestingly enough, here in Canada, up until just maybe 5 or 6 years ago, where the vast majority of Jews would be quote-unquote centrist liberal. Along comes a prime minister who, some called him the best prime minister Israel never had. In that he embraces the state of Israel, and good for him for doing that, in that he stands up and defends the state of Israel. And all of a sudden, on that one issue alone, I think based on this existential angst, the voting pattern in this country shifted almost entirely to the right. It's something to think about. For better or for worse, it's something to think about, because what it has done is that all the other issues that were so important to us as Jews are no longer even in our consciousness. Healthcare, refugee issues, all those issues I talked about before, only Israel matters. And I know this as a person who actually ran for a political party, or a provincial political party, the Liberals. When I knocked on Jewish doors, they told me, oh, I'm voting for Harper. And I could say, he's not running in this election.
Or in your constituency.
Okay, I want to ask all 3 of you 3 questions, and then we'll open up to the audience. Do we have a microphone in the audience? Yes, we do. Okay. So here's the first question. You all heard in the presentation of the Pew data that Jews in the United States are less religious than the general American public. And that fits with the picture of the United States. and here it is an exception, it is the most religious society in the developed world. We look a lot more like Europe in Canada than we look like you in the United States. Let me ask the three of you, when you situate the Jewish community in Canada in the general Canadian public, are Jews more religious, about average, or less religious? What's the difference from the data that Greg represents? Let me start with you, Frank.
Okay. More.
More.
Yeah, definitely, because again, we don't have data, but part of our data right now, but my sense is that very few people who were raised or whose grandparents were raised as Christians, whatever that means, identify themselves as Christians. That is to say, obviously going to church, etc., etc. Yeah, it's really quite low. It's of course the Muslims and the non-Mosaic religions that Canadian recent immigrants follow that make them perhaps as or perhaps more religious than Jews, Canadian Jews are.
What do you find, Rabbi Aaron, in downtown Toronto?
Hard to say. Anecdotally, I would say that what Frank's saying sounds right. I certainly know plenty of non-Jews. Almost none of them is religiously affiliated. And unlike Jews, they won't say, oh, I'm ethnically Christian or something like that. They'll just say, like, oh, I'm secular, right? Like, I might ask, oh, were you raised with religion? I'll say, oh, I was nominally raised, going to United Church twice a year or Anglican or whatever. But I do find that most non-Jews I know are not particularly religiously affiliated.
Bernie?
So here's my conundrum. I live in Thornhill. If I walk outside my door, I would have to say without a doubt that Canada is far more Jewishly religious than any place else. But I'm also a person of Canada and a person of the world, and I've gone outside the borders of Thornhill. My shul was and I say was, I'll get back to that in a moment, a conservative shul up in Thornhill, down the Don Mills area, that was thriving when my wife and I were just having children. We had to double up on bar mitzvahs. Today that shul is closing down.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that in synagogues right across the country. Certainly in the small towns, forget it. There are no more shuls in Cornwall and in other small Jewish towns and villages. Here in Toronto, there are a number of small shuls that are either conservative, well, mostly conservative, sad to say, that are closing down. The ones that are remaining stable, from my point of view, both anecdotally and from what I've been able to see in my travels, are the Orthodox shuls. And I think that tells us something.
Okay, the second difference, so there is a difference, I think, between the Jewish community in Canada and the Jewish community in the United States. But that's largely a Canada-US difference, rather than inter-community difference. Our surround is different. Now, Bernie put his hand, I think, on a second big difference. And we feel this probably most strongly in Toronto, less so in Winnipeg and Montreal. We have, of course, a geography of Jewish communities in this country, but there is everywhere. But that is the distance from the Holocaust and the proportion of the community that has direct experience with the Holocaust as the shaping identification. One of the things that surprised me in Greg's data was the strong identification with the Holocaust among American Jews. I found that surprising, Greg. Let me ask the three of you, and I'll start with you, Rabbi Aaron. How big a factor is that in the community that you work with?
I don't have any data on the importance of Holocaust remembrance among downtown Jews or among people who are involved in Macomb. I would say that, again, anecdotally, there is a sense among downtown Jews of, let's say, Holocaust fatigue. And I don't think that's because people don't appreciate the enormity of the impact of the Shoah on the Jewish community. I think it relates more to the very strong focus of the, let's say, more mainstream or establishment Jewish community in Toronto on the Shoah. And that, whether it's pure correlation or causation or anything, but Jews you find downtown tend not to be interested in that strong a focus on the Shoah, but more interested in talking not about issues of Jewish survival, but if they're going to be engaged on the level of something Jewish, they want to be engaged on the level of Jewish content in their lives.
That's consistent with what David and I might see among Jewish students at university as well. That there's much less attention to the Holocaust and much more to a positive content, to a strong affiliation, even if it's Jewish humor, frankly. Frank, what do you find?
Thank you. The Holocaust became a pillar of Jewish, what I call a pillar of Jewish identity, ethnic identity in Canada. In the 70s and in the 80s, there was a long process by which that happened. Question is, is that trend, continuing, especially with the millennial generation? And again, from what I'm seeing, on campuses, I think it still is, but I don't think it's as great as it was 15 years ago when I first started teaching the Holocaust at universities, or 35 years ago when I first started teaching the Holocaust in general. But nevertheless, it's very interesting that for people who have no memory or experience of the Holocaust, which is to say people born or raised in Canada before 1945, that the Holocaust came to be embraced in this respect. What I've been saying for a long time, however, is that there's a downside, if you will, or a negative side to this embrace, and that is that the Holocaust then becomes the cover for retreatment, for isolation, if you will, which I think is taking place in large part across the spectrum of Canadian Jewry. The misperceptions of the existence of, or the increase, if you will, of anti-Semitism and of anti-Zionism in this country. And I think, in large part, going back to what Bernie had just said, helps explain why the Conservatives won 52% of the popular vote, the Jewish vote, in the last federal election.
Which is really astounding as a change with you.
Very much.
Let me turn to Bernie to follow up on what was, I think, a very provocative comment. It comes to the third element that's in your data today. And interestingly, in the data, I don't know if you have, but because these are separable, you didn't really present any data on how concerned Jews in the United States are about anti-Semitism. That is a recurrent theme in the discussion in the Canadian Jewish community. You may have some, so I'm going to come to you in a minute. But if I heard Bernie correctly, Bernie said the switch to advocacy, the narrowing of the agenda, is a strategic mistake given the lower levels of identification with Israel that we see in each generation, and the greater criticism that we hear and that Greg showed us in the data of aspects of Israel's policy. Did I hear you correctly? Did I understand you? So you elaborate, and then we'll go the other way.
So let me elaborate on this a little bit. I think it's important to understand that anti-Semitism remains a problem in this world. It doesn't necessarily remain a huge problem here in Canada, and we must not confuse anti-Semitism with anti-Israelism and anti-Zionism, and that's very much what a lot of us are doing today. So as a result, we have narrowed our vision. There is old-time anti-Semitism. There are people still out there who hate the Jews. They're much less than they ever were. The sad news is that the level of anti-Zionism seems to have increased in a manner that I think is even difficult to measure. But that doesn't mean that the vast majority of non-Jews out there hate Israel. For the most part, I think what they end up saying is a pox on both your houses. But, and this is to me the key element, it is urgent for us as Jews to maintain a watchful advocacy eye on Israel, here in Canada, in the United States, in Europe. But it's just as important, it may be even more important, for us to be part of the general world. It is important for us to embrace who we are as Canadians. We are Canadian Jews. You know, I tell a story. When the Canadian Jewish Congress first came to be in the early 1900s, they were struggling with the name. What are we going to call this organization? Should we call it the Jewish Canadian Committee? Should we call it the Jewish Canadian Association? They decided on the Canadian Jewish Congress because they wanted to put Canadian, but they wanted to say, we are Canadian. And that is why they embraced issues of equality, issues of ethics, issues of social justice. By becoming parochial now, by concentrating only on Israel, and please nobody get me wrong, we of course have to concentrate on Israel, but when it is only Israel, we take ourselves outside of the Canadian experience, and that is something that in the long run, I think will be bad for Canadian Jewry.
Frank.
There's not much to say after that because we've worked together for so long on this. You know, when Congress was dissolved, all right, it's not that Congress dissolved, it was dissolved.
Very, very diplomatic language.
I was going to say incinerated, but I guess there was nary a whimper, and as Bernie alluded to, like still there are significant numbers of Canadian Jews who don't know that Congress no longer exists. You know, it wasn't the be-all and end-all. We you know, certainly know the warts probably better than the majority of Canadian Jews do. But nevertheless, there is, unfortunately, I think, if things are so good for the Jews, why are they so bad? Attitude, feeling amongst many Canadian Jews. I think many Canadian Jews looking at this Pew survey would say the American Jewry is on the road to extinction. Right? Extinction. It's a slippery slope. It's on the road to extinction.
That's not what Greg's data said.
You're right. That's not what Greg's data said. But I think that some Canadian Jews would see that data, would see that intermarriage, would see that, you know, whatever it is, 20% or whatever it was, Greg, of Jews who have one Jewish parent, you know, don't raise their kids Jewish, etc., etc. I can't remember if that was the exact number. So I'm going to stop there.
Last comment to you, Rabbi Aaron, and then I see people at the mic and I want to bring everybody in.
So something that I think is interesting in terms of looking at the issue of, let's say, internal Jewish concern versus Jewish concern for issues in the broader society that I think comes out from the Pew data that Greg wasn't able to present, but it's buried in there, is looking at not just American Jews' perception of anti-Semitism, but their perception of discrimination against other groups in America as compared to the general US population's perception of discrimination against those groups. So Jews in the US are much more likely to think that there is discrimination in the US against Muslims, against blacks, against Latinos, and against gays and lesbians than the general Jewish population.
And Native Americans as well.
I didn't make that on that.
I don't remember that, but you got all that exactly right.
So there is
and
data in the survey.
Yeah,
Yes,
so, I mean, there's tons of stuff in the survey. Greg obviously can only present like a small section of it. But that actually was something that, well, didn't really find surprising, especially I'm from the US, I've only lived here for 8 years, but it actually, at some level, gives, it heartens me, because I feel like even amongst Jews who don't actively identify with Judaism as a religion or with Jewish traditions or things like that, it seems that implicitly the vast majority of Jews have imbibed, I would say, is the foundation of Jewish ethics, which is remember you were slaves in Egypt, which is like the refrain in the Torah whenever there's an ethical injunction, it's don't oppress the stranger because you were strangers in Egypt, etc. Right? So that I think has become so integrated into the Jewish ethos that that's not getting erased, even as other aspects of Jewish identity are falling by the wayside. Look, I don't think that's necessarily going to maintain Jewish communities or Jewish institutions or Jewish ritual practices, et cetera, but I do think that that is something that can be seen as a positive value that's borne out by the data.
Okay, we're going to go to all of you, and because we will finish on time. There are microphones which are creating all this feedback right now, but I'm going to ask you to go to the microphone. And what I'm going to ask is that you genuinely ask the question, okay? And if it takes you longer than 60 seconds to ask the question, I'll ask it for you based on what I hear. Okay? So because I want to make sure everybody gets a chance.
There was a number I saw about 2 years ago, so I think it precedes this most recent survey, which said that, I'm pretty sure it was Pew, had estimated the current number of Jews in the United States at 7 million, using a different methodology. So I want to ask if that's your number, if it's correct, how you came to that number, and then I want to ask the panelists, we always use a 10-to-1 ratio to compare U.S. demographic data to Canada, and that would give us a much higher number than what I'm accustomed to hearing for Canada. And I recognize everything Frank said about we don't have any data, and we all know why, but would we think, using your methodology, we would come to a similar number for the estimate of the Canadian Jewish population?
So let's go to Greg first and then to Glenn.
Well, the Pew Research Center is a large organization. I cannot speak to everything that we've done over the years, but I am virtually certain that we have never estimated the size of the Jewish population until this survey. So I don't think that 7 million figure was probably ours. With that said,
is there an estimate in your survey?
yes, and so that estimate is not too far off from what we did estimate with this new survey. What we estimated with this new survey, and I'm going to read to make sure I get it right, is that there are about 5.3 million Jewish adults using the criteria that I discussed. And in addition to that, there are another 1.3 million Jewish children. That is to say, children being raised in households where there is at least one Jewish adult, and who our survey respondent described as being raised as at least partly Jewish. If you add those two numbers together, the 5.3 and the 1.3, they actually don't quite add up, but our total estimate is 6.7 million. The reason for the discrepancy is simply due to rounding. So our current estimate based on this survey is 6.7 million Jews, adults and children in the United States.
Frank?
Yeah, thanks. David, I guess we're looking at about 2% of the American population being Jewish.
That's right.
And we're looking at Canada, we're looking at about 1.1, 1.2. At one time it was as high as about 1.7. But in the United States it was as high as 3%. So, the proportions in Canada and the United States have been declining more or less in tandem.
I can throw in some actual data.
Yes, hi. Jazz, I'm going to violate your thing for just a second. I'm going to take seriously the question, what can, in fact, Canada learn from the US? And I have to set that up for Greg by basically the problematic with what each of the people said. Bernie, your controversial thing about potentially our loss of focus on ethics, etc., is because I think if we ask the presidents of the Conference of American Jews the same questions, we get what we have in Canada. The problem is not as bad as the fact that our one advantage over the US that we had was we had demographic data on Canadians, which we no longer have because of the actions of the present government. We also never had good attitudinal surveys of Canadian Jewry or Canadian citizens. The last one we had of scientific value was in 1990 in Toronto. I know because I did it. It's the only study ever done with random digit dialing methodology in Canada. So, what I want to ask Greg, which you, Bernie, hinted at, and Rabbi Aaron hinted at, is, in fact, a portrait of a Canadian Jew is illusory, just like a portrait of the American Jew is illusory. Because from my research, I would say that in many ways, the Jewish community of Toronto is more similar to the Jewish community of Baltimore than the Jewish community of Toronto is to the Jewish community of Vancouver. And the Jewish community of Vancouver, in many ways, is more similar to the Jewish community of San Diego or Denver than it is to the Jewish community of Canada. And both Bernie and Aaron hinted at it because, in fact, the reality in Thornhill, Jewishly, is very different than the reality for Aaron, Jewishly. So regional differences are often really critical and may be more informative to our Canadian reality. So my question to you, Greg, is what have you found in terms of, once you looked at regional variation within the United States, and especially if you looked at some of the big cities like Denver and San Diego versus New York and Baltimore, that might be instructive for guiding us in terms of trying to think of comparisons.
That's a great question. I'm going to ask you for a short answer, Greg.
I have a short answer because I don't know the answer. But I would just say, I would just simply confirm that you're absolutely correct, that the Jewish community in New York is absolutely distinctive compared to the Jewish community in Baltimore and Chicago and Los Angeles. Unfortunately, what we don't have in the survey is enough we don't have enough cases to be able to look down at the level of the city. We can look at things by region, but even there, even within regions, there's great variety across cities depending on the individual communities in which people live. I think it's a great point. It's a great question. I'd love to do more scientific community surveys in the United States and Canada, but I just can't speak to specifics in these.
I think the evidence for regional variation is so strong anecdotally. We just have to listen to Rabbi Aaron and to Bernie talk for 5 minutes and we understand. Mr. Klein.
Yeah, I'm interested in questioning intermarriage. I think this study is superb and it raises a dozen questions I would love to ask. The problem with intermarriage is that we treat it simplistically. And I just want to throw a few variables out for you and possibly anybody else who wants to talk about it. When somebody converts to Judaism, when the non-Jewish spouse converts, or agrees, as in one case, I have a cousin who's married to a Catholic, and the kids are in Jewish schools, and she loves Christmas, and she accepts her husband's commitment to Judaism. But I could go on and on like this, but I guess the specific question is what kind of categories do you have in intermarriage, and particularly with the case where there is a conversion of the non-Jewish spouse?
Great question. And I think I do have a good answer to this one. What we did in the survey is we actually asked, remember those questions I put up at the beginning that we asked each individual about themselves? We also asked married individuals the same questions about their spouse. So we know for each respondent whether or not they're married to someone who's Jewish by religion, or who is a Jew of no religion, or who is not Jewish in any way. And if their spouse is Jewish by religion, we also ask them whether or not their spouse had converted to Judaism, whether or not their spouse, if their spouse had been raised Jewish, we didn't ask that. But if their spouse had not been raised Jewish, we did ask if they converted. So we have similar categories. I think just another thought that occurs to me, raised by your question, is, I've had people ask me, remember the slide that showed that most people in their 20s who were raised by one Jewish parent are Jewish today? And some people have pointed to that, some observers have pointed to that as good news, and have suggested that this means that intermarriage is helping the community to grow. I have also seen other scholars point to that number and say, those Jews in their 20s are only Jews because they haven't yet had a chance to get intermarried. And as soon as they enter their 30s and 40s and get married and marry a non-Jewish spouse, they're no longer going to consider themselves Jewish. So which direction it'll take, I don't know. Time will only tell, but I think these are very important questions.
I would like to understand, based on those surveys, where are we heading in our diaspora? If you can find a reasonable comparison. To me, Israel is a very significant component in our lives. It will be very interesting to hear you talking about Israel.
So I don't think Greg can probably answer that, but let me take a shot at it. Actually, this debate is part of a much larger debate that Peter Beinart began about the growing gap between liberal North American Jewry and Israel, as Israel's politics move to the center-right, whereas North American Jews, and especially the millennials, are increasingly liberal. And Peter's data and articles reflect one view of the way your data could be interpreted. In Israel, there's no good survey data on how Israelis think about their relationship with different diasporas, because there are multiple diasporas. But what there is, and it's very interesting, we've just seen in the last week an announcement by the government of Israel that for the first time, there is going to be a massive increase in investment in what they call the diaspora. So it's to compensate for the funding that is flowing into Israel from the diaspora. There is now going to be an investment by the government of Israel in diaspora relations. Its diplomatic community are going to be educated to pay as much attention to the Jewish community in which they're posted as they are to relationships with the government. And there was, of course, as is always true, a bitter cabinet fight among 4 ministers who each thought they had a piece of this funding. So if you ignore all that black noise, literally, what the arguments that swirled around this were very much that the future of Israel is connected to an active, engaged, identified diaspora. And therefore, it's appropriate because Israel will shortly, if it has not already, become the place where the majority of world Jews live. So there's a shifting balance, an evolving balance now between Israel and God. One last question.
Oh, thank you. I guess, right? Hi, I'm Rosalyn Krieger. I host a show called All Things Jewish, and Bernie's a regular on my show because we are very much aligned politically. But I welcome all kinds of Jews on my show. So my question is, though, for you, Mr. Smith, did you account for Sephardic and Ashkenaz demographics in your questions? And also, to take into account, at least amongst Ashkenaz Jews, the whitening of Jews and feeling less oppressed and more willing to intermarry, because I see myself as white-ish, but not white, because I'm not Catholic. I don't have that privilege. So for me, I'd like to, can you account for those breakdowns in your status?
Did you break your data down by Ashkenaz Sephardi?
No, we did not actually. We thought about including a question about that. That question had been included on the NJPS studies in the past, but we ultimately couldn't ask everything that we would have loved to ask, and so we don't have that in these data.
So let me begin by thanking you for, you can see what a rich conversation we've had. The Pew report is long, but worthwhile reading because we could only present a small slice of the data. And Bernie is sitting next to me bemoaning every time you answer a question, bemoaning the fact that we do not have good long census data, which can compare in the way that Frank did, and Frank and a handful of others did, so that we in this country, frankly, are ignorant of what our own community looks like. That's what happens when you don't have good long census data. So you've really enriched us this evening. Thank you. I want to say a special thank you to Rabbi Aaron, to Frank, and to Bernie. I really did pull a fast one on you. You sure did. And yet you responded with grace and humor to what was fundamentally an unfair tactic. So I'm grateful to all the three of you. And before I call in Rabbi Swinburne,
Will you entertain my short question?
No.
I've waited for a very long time.
I know, but
I
you'll
think it
come.
was inappropriate for you to cut off when I was at the microphone
Well, you know
lineup.
what? We have several others who are waiting.
No, but they weren't in the lineup.
We promised to finish at 9:30, but we'll come up and ask, and we'll make sure.
It's a very short question.
We're going to finish at 9:30 in the way we said we're going to
Well, we
finish.
can do that.
Okay.
So my very short question is it's inappropriate for you to cut me off when
Come
I
and
was in
have
the
that
lineup.
argument with me after.
Okay. So my very short question is there a plan of any national organization to budget funds for a Canadian version of the Pew Report?
Okay, we will answer that question after. Let me just say again, thank the Kleins for sponsoring such a wonderful evening. And if I can make one personal comment, what I found most stunning in your report, not much surprised me, but that Jewish children would not consider Jewish food. It's stunning.
Can I just ask you to stay for just a few more minutes? There's so much to say to one another. So I remember having to make a decision. I think I will see you better if I'll get on here. Is that okay? May I? All right. I remember having to make a decision about moving from United States to Canada or not. In addition to being in love with my husband, I was advised by a friend, yes, go ahead and do it, but be prepared, you're going back in time. Oh. I have to say that I've never been happier to go back in time than today. So let me just explain just very briefly what I mean by that. Blending both Russian, Israeli, American, or Canadian identities, I would say that there's certain staple things that work for the Jewish people worldwide, but they work even more so here in Canada, and that is shul, gathering on Shabbat, surprise from the rabbi, or gathering in general, strong Jewish education, Jewish camps for our kids, Jewish conversation, Jewish knowledge, and Jewish gathering of being peoplehood and sharing experiences with one another. I was absolutely delighted to see the sense of humor important to both Jews of religion and of Jews of no religion. Like, how fabulous is that we connect? But what does Jewish humor mean? It means shared conversation. And shared conversation is done in civilization, Jewish civilization, which is profoundly reconstructionist concept that we here at Darchei Noam adhere to great. It is muddled, it is laughed together, it is sharing of one's history and Jewish experience For that, Jews have to be together, whether they are downtown or whether they are in North York. So Jewish knowledge is where it is. Well, but I just have two things where I have to put microphone and then pick it up. So it's a bouquet of flowers for a woman who smiles, and I see a garden patch. Suzanne, it's for you, my very first president. And of course, Marty, in this bag is my mother's strudel. I just would like to say that it is a cultural experience that leads you to a religious ecstasy. Welcome to Darchei Noam, everybody. Come here.
Thank you all very much. There is, I believe, food and a little reception in the back, and speakers you can talk to before they leave.